Long before the first foreign ships appeared on the horizon, the land that would one day be called America was home to cultures so vast, varied, and sophisticated that many of their truths sound almost unbelievable today. Did you know some native tribes performed successful skull surgeries using stone tools, and their patients often survived? Or that the Great Plains tribes could communicate across languages using a complex and refined system of hand signs? In the dense forests of the Northeast, Iroquois runners could carry messages over hundreds of miles in just a few days, while in the Southwest, ancient engineers built irrigation systems so advanced they rivaled those of ancient Rome. These were not primitive peoples waiting for civilization. They were civilizations in their own right, with strange wonders, silent wisdom, and stories too often forgotten. Before colonists set foot on the continent, native societies flourished in every corner of the land. From the snowy tundras of the north to the lush swamps of the southeast, native peoples had created cultures that mirrored their environments, adaptive, intricate, and entirely their own. The Mississippian peoples, centered around the great mound city of Cahokia, built massive earthen pyramids larger than those in Egypt at the time. Over 20,000 people lived in that city, more than London, in the year 1200. In the dry desert canyons of the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans constructed sprawling apartment-style cliff dwellings with natural air conditioning, while the Tlingit and Haida in the Northwest carved massive totem poles that recorded ancestral stories and spiritual truths as tall as trees. The land was not wild. It was known, tended, shaped, and respected. Controlled burns were used by many tribes to renew the forest and attract game. Crops, like the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, were grown together in a brilliant agricultural system that supported one another and replenished the soil naturally. In the Andes and the highlands of Mesoamerica, their cousins grew over 3,000 types of potatoes and developed calendars more precise than those used in Europe. Every region had its knowledge, and every people carried their own legacy, preserved not in books, but in memory, in songs, dances, carvings, tattoos, and stars. This was a world built not on conquest, but on connection. The concept of land ownership, as understood by European colonists, was foreign. To native peoples, the land was alive, not just dirt and rock, but spirit. Mountains were ancient ancestors. Rivers were sacred pathways. Animals were not commodities, they were kin. When the Lakota hunted buffalo, they did so with reverence, using every part: bones, hide, meat, sinew. No waste, no greed, just balance. Harmony wasn't an ideal, it was a necessity. Governance, too, was far from chaotic. The Iroquois Confederacy, also called the Haudenosaunee, was a sophisticated alliance of multiple nations who practiced consensus-based democracy, a system that would later influence the framers of the U.S. Constitution. In many societies, women held extraordinary power. Among the Cherokee and Iroquois, women chose the chiefs, managed the land, and passed down the clan name. Gender was understood more fluidly in many tribes, and those who today might be called Two-Spirit were often held in high regard, seen as spiritual leaders, healers, or wise guides bridging the physical and spiritual realms. And then there were the stories whispered by firelight, carried on winds, etched into petroglyphs and remembered in ritual. Stories that told of Sky Woman falling to the earth on the back of a turtle, of trickster crows and thunder beings, of great floods and talking animals, of ancestors who walked among the stars. These were not fables. They were living maps, spiritual, moral, historical, woven into the rhythms of life. Through these stories, people knew who they were and where they stood in the great web of existence. Yes, there were conflicts. There were wars and alliances, feasts and famines. But there was also order, deeply rooted in respect. Disputes were settled in councils, not courts. Punishments were often focused on restoration rather than revenge. Peace was not the absence of war. It was a goal upheld by tradition, ceremony, and shared memory. This was the world before the ships came. A world not empty, but full, not waiting to be discovered, but already deeply known. Here, the wind spoke in old languages. The rivers remembered names now long erased, and every star had a place in the stories of the people below. In this quiet, we can still listen. We can still remember. We can still hear the heartbeat of a continent, alive, with voices that refused to be silenced, and dreams that still echo in the bones of the land. When the first sails appeared on the horizon, they came not with thunder or fire, but with quiet curiosity. And yet, with them arrived one of the greatest silent devastations in human history. A wave of invisible killers that would sweep the continent long before most native peoples ever laid eyes on a European face. It is a strange truth that many tribes encountered disease before they encountered the men who carried it. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. They arrived like phantoms, spreading through trade routes, infecting blankets, breath, and water, jumping from one village to the next faster than any army ever could. Some native nations tell of the sky darkening, not with clouds, but with birds of death. Vultures circling villages where entire families had perished in their sleep. Whole towns emptied in silence. Imagine a world where 9 out of every 10 people around you die, often within days. That is not exaggeration. In some areas, especially along the eastern seaboard, up to 90% of the indigenous population died within a generation of first contact. The forests grew wild over the bones of the fallen. Paths disappeared. Memories were buried with no one left to speak them. And what made these diseases so deadly? European settlers, for centuries, had lived closely with domesticated animals, pigs, cows, chickens, animals that shared their homes, and with them, their germs. Over generations, Europeans had developed partial immunity to many of the microbes that these animals carried. But in the Americas, where there were no pigs in the kitchen, no cattle in the streets, there was no such shared resistance. The immune systems of native peoples were as untouched as their lands, and just as vulnerable. One of the strangest ironies of this devastation was that it helped create the myth of the empty wilderness. By the time many English settlers arrived in New England, the coastlines had already been ravaged by waves of disease. Great coastal tribes like the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Abenaki had lost much of their population, their villages eerily silent. European observers saw cleared fields, overgrown orchards, and abandoned homes, and believed the land had been prepared for them by divine providence. They did not understand they were walking through ghost towns. Sometimes disease arrived hand in hand with violence. In the early 1760s, during Pontiac's rebellion, British soldiers at Fort Pitt were documented giving blankets infected with smallpox to native leaders, an early and chilling case of biological warfare. But long before that, it spread simply through contact. A handshake, a breath, a shared pipe. The same openness and generosity that led many native peoples to welcome European newcomers also exposed them to contagion. The act of kindness became an act of vulnerability. And yet, the horror of disease was not only physical, it was spiritual, cultural, and emotional. For communities so rooted in oral tradition, the loss of elders meant more than personal grief. It meant the loss of stories, songs, medicine knowledge, clan histories, entire world views vanishing without written record. Imagine a people whose wisdom is passed from mouth to ear, from one generation to the next, suddenly losing the voice that carries it forward. The silence that followed was more than quiet. It was a rupture in time. Still, there was resilience. In many tribes, rituals of mourning were adapted, medicine ways shifted, and spiritual leaders sought answers in visions and ceremony. Some survivors believed the world was ending. Others believed they were being tested by the spirits. Some tried to isolate. Others moved deeper into the interior, seeking safety in sacred mountains and river valleys. Villages once opened to trade, and friendship became wary, cautious, quiet. Hope dimmed, but it did not disappear. There are records, too, of strange dreams during this period. Visionaries among the Cree and Ojibwe spoke of great plagues in the form of black fog or animal spirits with white eyes. In the Andes, Inca priests dreamed of cities drowning in white waves long before the Spanish reached their doors. These dreams were not explanations, but expressions of deep ancestral grief. The kind of grief that lives not just in memory, but in the bones of future generations. So this was the first shadow, not a battle, not a war, not even a visible enemy. It was silence, a silence that crept across villages, forests, rivers, and mountain passes. A silence that stole elders, children, songs, and seasons. Before the gun, before the chain, before the treaty, it was disease that brought the first great horror to the native peoples of this land. A quiet apocalypse. And in that quiet, the world began to change. Not by choice, but by sorrow. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea of a gift, offered with a smile, wrapped in ritual, only to discover it was poisoned with betrayal. In the early encounters between native peoples and European settlers, much was exchanged: food, knowledge, language, symbols. But just beneath these gestures of friendship, there grew a darker thread: deception. And in time, this deception would open the door to the first bloody conflicts. What began with handshakes would end in gunfire. One of the earliest and most haunting stories comes from the 1600s, when the English first settled in what would become Massachusetts. The Wampanoag people, weakened by previous plagues, approached the newcomers not with hostility, but with help. Squanto, a Patuxet man who had been kidnapped years earlier and taken to Europe, and who somehow returned alive, taught the pilgrims how to plant corn with fish, how to find wild herbs, how to survive. And yet, in a cruel twist of history, the very people his people had helped would later turn against their neighbors in wars that nearly destroyed them. Strange details surface in these early moments. Some settlers gave native leaders silver medallions bearing European crests, calling them tokens of peace. But these medallions were sometimes used to mark which tribes were loyal and which could be targeted. Guns were traded for fur, but they were often faulty, rusted, or intentionally sabotaged. In some cases, colonists gave wool clothing laced with lice, claiming it was a gift. In others, they gifted alcohol, a substance previously unknown to many tribes, and watched as it spread through communities with devastating effect. Alcohol, some elders later said, was more destructive than any war. As the settlers expanded, so too did their hunger for land. And with each year, the line between diplomacy and deceit blurred. Treaties were drawn up in languages native leaders could not read. Entire plots of land were sold with no understanding that the sale was permanent. For many native peoples, land could no more be sold than the sky. It was shared, sacred, part of the spirit world. But European law twisted that belief, and many tribes found themselves bound by ink they never agreed to. It was not uncommon for colonists to forge signatures or hold councils where only a few representatives were invited, those most desperate, most weakened, or least respected. Then they would claim a treaty had been made. The first large-scale conflicts erupted soon after. In 1637, the Pequot War marked a turning point. The English colonists, allied with the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes, attacked a Pequot village in what is now Connecticut. At dawn, they set fire to the village and slaughtered men, women, and children as they fled. One Englishman wrote of the massacre, saying they had done a sweet sacrifice to God. The Narragansett, shocked by the brutality, later withdrew their support. Even in war, they had not seen such savagery. And this was just the beginning. Over the next decades, dozens of skirmishes and wars would erupt. The Powhatan Wars in Virginia, Kieft's War in New Netherland, and King Philip's War in New England. One of the deadliest per capita conflicts in American history. These were not just wars for survival. They were wars against confusion. Wars fought by peoples who had once offered peace, who had shared food, who had held sacred councils with strangers they now saw building fences and forts. Among the strangest tales from this era is that of Metacom, also known as King Philip, the Wampanoag leader who tried to preserve peace until there was no choice left. He had walked in English towns, worn English clothes, even signed treaties. But after betrayal upon betrayal, he led his people in revolt. When he was finally hunted down and killed in 1676, his head was placed on a spike and displayed in Plymouth for over 20 years. A gruesome warning, and a sign of how far things had fallen from the first shared harvests. Even in these early years, some settlers warned of the moral decay within their own colonies. Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, defended native land rights and criticized his fellow colonists for their greed. But his voice, like those of many Indigenous allies, was drowned out by the roar of expansion. The gifts were broken, the handshakes forgotten. What remained were ashes, sorrow, and the knowledge that something sacred had already begun to die. This was how the first conflicts came, not as sudden eruptions, but as slow unravelings. Woven into every war was a quiet betrayal, and beneath every peace offering, a shadow. For the native peoples of this land, the age of deception had begun, and with it, the long road of resistance. It said the land remembers, that it carries the weight of footsteps, the echo of drums, the hush of languages no longer spoken. And as more ships arrived, crowding the shores with wooden hulls and weary passengers, the land began to feel a different weight, not of reverence, but of hunger. A hunger for possession, for boundaries, for fences. This was not just exploration. This was expansion, and it came with a hunger that would never be satisfied. It might seem odd to think of land as something one could own. For many native peoples, this idea was not just foreign, it was unthinkable. Land was a relative. It was not bought or sold, but belonged to all, just as the wind or the rain did. You could live with the land. You could honor it, tend it, ask its permission. But to divide it with borders, to write it into ledgers, to fence it off and claim it as a product, that was madness. And yet, for European settlers, this was the very heart of their purpose. The land was a resource to be claimed, cultivated, consumed. One strange and little-known fact is that some early settlers actually believed that if Native Americans didn't build fences or plow the soil in a European way, they didn't truly own the land. The English called it vacant, the legal doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, quietly justified theft by framing indigenous stewardship as absence. Forests where native people hunted became wilderness. Sacred sites were deemed unused. In the eyes of colonial law, native presence was invisible unless it mimicked European structure. The appetite for land grew quickly. Colonists wanted more than just a clearing for a house. They wanted fields, pastures, forests for timber, rivers for mills. The first grants were modest, but as colonies spread, they grew bold. Virginia's claims stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Pennsylvania promised land to European immigrants who had never even set foot on American soil. Entire tracts were mapped and parceled out before any settler had seen them, and before native nations had even heard their names. These expansions were often justified by something called the doctrine of discovery, a strange but powerful idea passed down from 15th century papal decrees. It stated that any land not inhabited by Christians could be claimed by Christian rulers, a legal ghost that still lingers in modern law. This belief, both religious and imperial, gave colonists the moral permission they sought, and it turned native resistance into an act not of sovereignty, but of rebellion, a crime. To the native peoples of these lands, the consequences were immediate and heartbreaking. Families who had lived for generations along rivers found their fishing grounds blocked by mills or poisoned by runoff. Trails that once connected villages were bulldozed into roads. Burial sites were plowed under. Trees used for sacred purposes were chopped down for timber. In the span of a few decades, entire nations were pushed off their homelands, often with only a vague promise of somewhere else to go. And it was not only the land that was lost, but the rhythm of life. The seasonal movements that defined indigenous existence, planting, hunting, gathering, ceremony, were interrupted. Tribes like the Lenape, who had lived along the Delaware River for centuries, were displaced again and again, pushed westward with each new wave of settlers. By the late 1700s, some Lenape were in Ohio, others in Indiana, and some all the way in Oklahoma. Their name means the original people, and yet they became strangers in a land they had known forever. Among the strangest chapters of this land, hunger were the so-called walking purchases, such as the infamous one in Pennsylvania in 1737. Colonial officials claimed that the Lenape had agreed to sell as much land as a man could walk in a day and a half. But the colonists prepared a cleared path in advance and hired the colony's fastest runners to cover an enormous distance. The result was the loss of over 1 million acres, stolen, not with weapons, but with deception and a stopwatch. Still, resistance continued. Some tribes formed alliances, sought court cases, or tried to adapt, planting in European styles, wearing settler clothes, even converting to Christianity, hoping that conformity might protect their land. But the hunger did not stop. It only grew. By the time of the American Revolution, the frontier had become a place of near constant conflict, a fault line between cultures with different visions of land, value, and belonging. The land remembered, and though the maps changed, though the treaties piled up, though the forests fell, the land still held the memory of what had come before. The footsteps, the songs, the fire rings left cold beneath the stars. The story of land hunger is not just about territory. It's about forgetting and being forgotten. But even in the silence, the memory lingers, and the story goes on. There is a strange detail, often forgotten, about the forced removals of native peoples in the 1800s, that they were sometimes carried out with printed tickets. Tickets, like those you might use to board a train or a ferry. Printed slips of paper handed to people being forced from their ancestral homelands, as if their dispossession were just a scheduled journey. But this was no journey. It was an exile, a long, cold march across unknown terrain, and for many, a walk into death. The most infamous of these removals came to be known in the Cherokee language as Nuna Daul Isunyi, the trail where they cried. But the Cherokee were not alone. Between the 1830s and 1850s, entire nations were driven from their lands in what's now the southeastern United States. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, Creek, and Seminole, the so-called 5 civilized tribes. They had adapted. They had written laws, built schools, printed newspapers, worn suits, practiced Christianity, even owned slaves, mimicking settler customs in a desperate effort to keep their lands. But none of it saved them. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a policy that gave legal cover to ethnic cleansing. It promised exchange, land in the West for land in the East. But the reality was brutal. The federal government and state militias used threats, bribes, fraud, and force. Some tribes were coerced into signing treaties they did not understand, and others were removed at gunpoint. The Choctaw were among the first to be moved, and one chief called it a trail of tears and death. The phrase stayed. Strange and painful things happened on those roads. Some families carried sacred bundles, herbs, ashes from home fires, bits of soil wrapped in deerskin, trying to preserve a piece of the world they were losing. Some elders refused to eat, choosing to die beside their homelands. Children were told stories at night, not to comfort, but to remind them who they were. Stories of tricksters and ancestors, of rivers and mountains they would never see again. For the Cherokee alone, it is estimated that over 16,000 people were forced to walk west, often without adequate clothing or food. They traveled through rain, snow, and bitter wind. Diseases like dysentery, whooping cough, and pneumonia swept through the camps. Nearly 4,000 died, many buried in unmarked graves along the roadside. Some were too sick to continue and were simply left behind. Others froze to death in the night. The dead were wrapped in blankets, or not at all. Survivors remembered the crunch of frozen earth as their only funeral. Not all removals were passive. The Seminole people of Florida resisted fiercely, leading the longest war in U.S. history against Native resistance. The Second Seminole War, which lasted from 1835 to 1842. Led by warriors like Osceola, they hid in the swamps, using guerrilla tactics to fight U.S. soldiers. Even after Osceola was captured under a white flag of truce and died in prison, the resistance continued. Some Seminole never surrendered, and their descendants remain in Florida to this day. The U.S. government called this policy humane, arguing that removal would protect Native peoples from extinction. But the cruelty of its execution betrayed the truth. This was not about preservation. It was about expansion, making way for cotton, plantations, and settlers. Native land became slave land. The land changed hands, and the rivers ran with new names, but the ground still remembered the feet that bled into its soil. In Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma, the relocated tribes tried to rebuild. They formed new governments, reopened schools, revived dances and songs. Some even reestablished the very institutions they had lost. But they were never the same. The trauma traveled with them. It entered their dreams, their ceremonies, their silences. It fractured families, and it created a new kind of identity, one born in grief. One eerie fact remains. The government sent missionaries along the trail not only to offer spiritual support, but to write down what they saw. Some of their journals describe children walking with frost-bitten feet, wrapped in rags, singing lullabies in Cherokee, their words disappearing into the wind. Some missionaries wept. Others simply recorded the statistics and moved on. This was not just a trail. It was a crucifixion road, stretched over thousands of miles and lined with sorrow. A quiet genocide, carried out step by step, mile by mile. And yet, somehow many endured. They carried stories, seeds, songs. They reached the new land, not because they believed in it, but because they had no choice. The trails of tears were not just one path. They were many, converging into a single truth, that the American promise of freedom was built on the forced marches of those it chose to forget. But memory is not so easily erased. The ground still holds their footprints, and in the hush of twilight, if you listen, you may still hear them walking. There's something deeply unsettling about a border you cannot see. A line drawn not in stone or fence, but in paper and law. Reservations, those patches of land assigned to Native peoples after their removal, often had boundaries so vague they were invisible. Yet, if a Native person stepped 1 foot beyond those limits, they could be jailed, shot, or forcibly returned. Invisible walls, silent prisons. This was the reservation system, a vast machine of control, masked as protection. Few realize that the word reservation didn't originally mean land set aside for Native people. It meant land that was reserved by the U.S. government after taking everything else. What was left over, the unwanted scrub and dry plains, became the new homes for entire nations. Sometimes the land was hundreds of miles from the tribe's original territory. Sometimes it was useless for farming. Always, it was smaller than what had been promised. One strange fact. Early U.S. officials often said that placing Native peoples on reservations would civilize them. They spoke of turning warriors into farmers, but in many areas, the land wasn't even arable. In South Dakota, tribes were moved to land where winter temperatures fell below -40 degrees, and crops couldn't grow. In Arizona, tribes were forced onto dry plateaus where the soil was like dust. Farming, they were told, would be their future. But the tools arrived broken, if they arrived at all. Over time, the reservation system became less about help and more about containment. Tribes were no longer allowed to roam freely. Hunting grounds were lost. Nomadic nations like the Lakota, who once followed the buffalo across thousands of miles, were told to stay within lines drawn on maps or be punished. The buffalo herds themselves were slaughtered by settlers and soldiers, not just for food, but as a tactic of war. In less than 2 decades, millions of buffalo were wiped out, bringing starvation to the Plains tribes and forcing them onto the reservations. And with confinement came control. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, BIA, created in 1824, became the overseer of every detail of life. On many reservations, Native people needed permission to leave, to marry, to work, even to wear traditional clothing. Tribal councils were dissolved or replaced with government-appointed leaders. Sacred ceremonies were banned. Children were taken to boarding schools. Language was criminalized. A people were not just being relocated, they were being remade. What made this more chilling was how systematic it was. Reservation agents kept detailed ledgers, names, rations, punishments. Some were brutal, corrupt, abusive, drunk with power. Others were simply bureaucrats, but to Native families, they were the law. Food was given in exchange for obedience. Step out of line, and your name was crossed off the ration list. In some cases, agents withheld food for entire villages, forcing compliance through hunger. There were also curious experiments. On some reservations, anthropologists were sent to study the people, measuring skulls, collecting songs, taking sacred items back to museums. Native elders were photographed like specimens. One Apache man recalled having his hair measured, his teeth counted, and his voice recorded on wax cylinders, all without explanation. The reservation had become a kind of living exhibit, a place where culture was not nurtured, but dissected. And yet, even in these harsh conditions, Native nations resisted. They planted when they could. They told stories in secret. They painted, danced, sang, sometimes hidden, sometimes openly defiant. Entire spiritual movements arose, like the ghost dance, a sacred ritual that promised a return of the old world, the return of the buffalo, the end of suffering. The ghost dance frightened the U.S. military. It looked too much like rebellion. And in 1890, it led to tragedy at Wounded Knee, where over 250 Lakota were massacred, men, women, and children, their bodies left frozen in the snow. Even today, the legacy of reservations is a complicated wound. Poverty, addiction, and unemployment remain high on many reservations, not because of laziness or failure, but because of decades of broken promises, withheld resources, and systemic oppression. Many reservations were deliberately placed far from trade routes, rail lines, and fertile soil. Some didn't receive electricity or plumbing until the late 20th century. And yet, they endure. Because the reservation, as strange and cruel as it was, became a space where identity could survive. Here, native languages were spoken in whispers until they could be shouted again. Ceremonies returned, councils reformed. A new generation rose, scarred but strong, carrying both the trauma and the flame. The reservation was meant to erase, but instead, it remembered. It held onto old songs and stories like seeds buried beneath ice. And now, those seeds begin to bloom again, even in the driest soil. It is a chilling truth. Some of the most brutal acts in American history were committed not with weapons, but with chalk and prayer. Across the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thousands of Native American children were taken from their families and sent to government-run and missionary-run boarding schools. Some were dragged away by force. Others were sent under threat of withheld rations, jail, or land seizure. Many never returned. The strange and tragic philosophy behind these schools was captured in a single infamous phrase: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." These words were spoken by U.S. Army officer Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania in 1879, the first of many such institutions. His aim was clear: to erase Native culture and replace it with white norms. The children would be stripped of their names, their language, their clothing, their hair, and slowly, their memories. One of the first things that happened upon arrival was the cutting of hair. Among many Native cultures, hair holds deep spiritual meaning. Cutting it can symbolize mourning, punishment, or loss. But here it was done en masse, by strangers with shears. Children wept as their braids fell to the floor. Then came the uniforms, the boots, the regimented schedules. Boys were taught carpentry, blacksmithing, and military drills. Girls were trained in housekeeping and sewing. Each task was a lesson in compliance. Perhaps the most disturbing part of this system was that it was framed as benevolence. Reformers and missionaries believed they were helping. They posed smiling in photographs beside silent, wide-eyed children dressed in wool coats and laced-up shoes. One before and after photo from Carlisle shows a young boy in traditional dress on one side, and then stiff in a suit and tie on the other, his eyes hollow. It was meant to show progress, but what it really captured was erasure. Inside the schools, Native languages were strictly forbidden. Children caught speaking their own tongue were punished, mouths washed out with soap, whipped, locked in dark closets. In some schools, they were made to stand in silence for hours, or forbidden from eating. Over time, some forgot their language entirely. Others learned to whisper it only in their dreams. But not all the pain was symbolic. Abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, was rampant. Many children died in these schools. Disease was common, especially tuberculosis and influenza, spreading quickly through overcrowded, unsanitary dormitories. Children were buried in school cemeteries, often without names, only small wooden markers or numbers. The Carlisle School alone recorded nearly 200 deaths, but the true toll across the system likely numbers in the thousands. Some of the most disturbing revelations came much later. In recent years, unmarked graves have been discovered at the sites of former boarding schools, first in Canada, then in the US too. These findings shook communities and reignited calls for truth, reconciliation, and accountability. They were grim confirmation of what Native families had whispered for generations, that many children were taken and never came home. And yet, Native families endured. Some parents hid their children in the woods. Some taught language and tradition in secret, behind locked doors. Some children, even inside the schools, resisted, keeping stories alive, writing letters home in their original languages, sneaking sacred objects under their mattresses. Survivors later told their stories in courtrooms, classrooms, documentaries, their voices cracked but unbroken. An eerie, lesser-known fact. In some schools, students were forced to act in plays and pageants, reenacting Thanksgiving myths or pretending to discover America. In these strange performances, Native children played the role of their own erasure. They bowed their heads in shame, as scripts dictated, and acted out their transformation into model Americans. The audience clapped. Some children stared into the lights and thought of home. Today, the legacy of the boarding school era lingers like smoke. Many survivors suffer from intergenerational trauma, the effects of stolen language, broken family lines, suppressed identity. Some grew up without knowing how to parent, having never been nurtured themselves. Others struggled with shame, with anger, with silence. And yet, there is also survival. Language revitalization programs, cultural camps, truth commissions. The seeds that were buried are sprouting again, because in the end, the system failed. It did not destroy a people. It did not erase the stories. Despite everything, the haircuts, the whippings, the graves, the songs are still sung, the dances still rise, the languages are returning. And in the silence between lessons, in the spaces where names were stolen and returned, the children whisper back. Not all were saved, but the people still remember. The Indian was never killed. He lived, quietly, defiantly, and still does. There's a strange irony buried deep in the pages of American history, that a nation founded on law and liberty became an empire of broken promises. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, the United States signed over 500 treaties with Native American tribes. Each was a formal agreement, recognized by Congress and bound by the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. And yet, every single treaty was broken, altered, or ignored. Not one remains fully honored. Some treaties were signed under duress, others through trickery, mistranslation, or manipulation. Many Native leaders couldn't read English. Some didn't understand the full meaning of what they were signing. Some signed with the belief that peace would follow, or that at least a portion of their homeland would be saved. Instead, the ink marked the beginning of loss. One eerie detail: many treaties were signed using ceremonial peace pipes, sacred items in many Native cultures. These pipes were symbols of trust. Once smoked together, a promise was meant to be unbreakable. But to the U.S. government, the rituals were only theater. Within months or years, the terms were rewritten, nullified, or swept aside entirely. The Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1851, for example, promised the Lakota, Cheyenne, and other Plains tribes vast territories stretching across present-day Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. It was meant to bring peace between tribes and settlers moving west. But almost immediately, gold was discovered in the Black Hills, land promised to the Lakota for all time. Settlers poured in. The U.S. government responded not by upholding the treaty, but by sending the military. The treaty was effectively discarded. The land was taken. Conflict erupted again. It wasn't just theft. It was betrayal cloaked in bureaucracy. The language of the treaties was often intentionally vague. Words like permanent and forever were used, but later reinterpreted. When tribes protested, they were told the treaties had expired or were invalidated by Congress. One government official famously said, The Indian is not a citizen and has no standing in court. In other words, a promise could be made to them and just as easily erased. One of the most devastating betrayals came after the Dawes Act of 1887. This act didn't look like war. It looked like reform. It promised land ownership to native families in exchange for abandoning tribal identity and communal landholding. But what it really did was shatter tribal nations. Land once held collectively by tribes was divided into small parcels. Surplus land, everything not assigned to individual native families, was then sold to white settlers. In total, over 90 million acres of native land were lost through this process. Some treaties, strangely, still remain on the books, like ghost laws, technically active but ignored. In 1868, the U.S. government promised the Sioux the right to hunt freely on their lands so long as the buffalo may range. When the buffalo were exterminated, the government claimed the treaty was void, but the treaty itself never included such a clause. Today, Native activists sometimes cite these ancient treaties in court, not always to win, but to remind the world of a truth written in ink and ignored in history. Another little-known fact: many of these treaties were accompanied by gifts, tools, blankets, food rations, meant to seal the deal. But these goods were often defective, spoiled, or never delivered at all. Blankets laced with disease, flour filled with weevils, broken plows, rusted pans. One leader said, bitterly, "They gave us crumbs from their table and called it peace." Even in the 20th century, the legacy of broken treaties continued. In the 1950s, the U.S. government launched a policy called termination, aimed at dissolving tribal governments and ending federal recognition of certain tribes altogether. It was, in effect, the last betrayal, not only ignoring the treaties, but pretending they had never existed. And yet, Native nations persist. Some have reclaimed treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather on ancestral lands. Others have filed lawsuits, won settlements, or reopened negotiations. But the truth remains. For Native peoples, the word treaty does not mean trust. It means a promise made, then buried. Treaties were supposed to be bridges. Instead, they became tools of conquest, written in cursive, sealed with handshakes, and broken in silence. Today, many Native elders still remember the names of those treaties, passed down through generations, like family heirlooms of grief. They speak of them not as legal documents, but as sacred wounds. And in the night, under starlight, when the wind moves through the grass like whispers, you might almost hear those names spoken again. Pine Ridge, Fort Laramie, Medicine Lodge, not as history, but as living memory. There's a quiet cruelty in being told who you should be, over and over, until you begin to forget who you were. After decades of removal, reservations, broken treaties, and boarding schools, the United States government shifted to a new strategy: assimilation. The idea was not just to remove Native peoples from their lands, but to erase their cultures, their languages, their very identities, and replace them with the image of a civilized American citizen. It was a policy wrapped in promises of opportunity, but executed with cold control. At the heart of assimilation was a belief, often expressed by policymakers, that Native cultures were primitive, backward, or uncivilized. This judgment became a justification for radical interventions. Laws and programs designed to remake Native people in the white image. One chilling phrase echoed through the halls of power. To civilize the Indian, you must kill the Indian. Not literally, but through cultural genocide, stripping traditions, forbidding languages, and demanding total conformity. One of the strangest facts about assimilation is how deeply it was linked to land ownership. The Dawes Act of 1887 not only divided communal lands into small private allotments, but also imposed a strict timeline for Native families to prove competency as farmers. If they failed, their land was sold off to non-Native settlers. The policy was a trap. Many families were unfamiliar with the imposed style of agriculture or lacked tools and support, setting them up to lose their land and livelihoods. Assimilation extended beyond land. Native children were sent to boarding schools far from home, institutions that were more than just educational centers. They were places of forced acculturation. But even after leaving the schools, Native people faced relentless pressure to abandon their languages and customs in daily life. In many towns and cities, they were forced to hide their identities, fearful of discrimination, or worse. In the 1920s and 1930s, the government pushed for Indian citizenship as a way to integrate Native people. But citizenship came with strings. To gain it, many had to renounce tribal affiliation or accept policies that weakened tribal sovereignty. Native people were left in a liminal space, neither fully accepted by mainstream society nor allowed to maintain their traditional ways. Another strange and little-known fact: assimilation policies also targeted Native religions. The Indian Religious Crimes Code of 1883 banned ceremonial dances, the use of sacred objects, and other spiritual practices. The sun dance, a sacred ritual for Plains tribes, was outlawed for decades. Some ceremonies were driven underground, preserved only in secret or whispered prayers. Those caught practicing faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. The federal government even intervened in Native family life. Social workers and agents monitored marriages and births, often dictating who could marry whom. There were attempts to control reproduction, with forced sterilizations occurring well into the 20th century. A horrifying chapter that remains largely unknown outside Native communities. The goal was clear: reduce Native populations under the guise of health and progress. Economic policies also played a role. Native people were often excluded from New Deal programs or offered limited aid. Jobs on reservations were scarce, and those that existed were usually menial and poorly paid. This created cycles of poverty that fed into stereotypes used to justify continued intervention. Yet, even in the darkest moments, Native communities found ways to resist assimilation. Elders passed down stories in whispers. Families gathered secretly for dances and feasts. Languages were taught at home, often hidden from government officials. One of the more astonishing facts is how many Native languages survived these bans, despite the official attempts to wipe them out. Today, revitalization programs draw on this hidden legacy. The story of assimilation is not just about loss. It's also about the fierce determination to survive, to carry forward identity, culture, and spirit, despite overwhelming pressure to conform. It is a testament to resilience in the face of systematic erasure. As the 20th century moved forward, Native activism began to grow. Young people returned from boarding schools with new ideas, blending traditional knowledge with lessons learned in white society. They formed organizations, protested, and demanded rights. The seeds of the Red Power movement and modern tribal sovereignty struggles were planted during these decades of forced assimilation. Still, the scars remain. The trauma of having one's identity attacked is deep and often invisible. It affects mental health, family relationships, and community cohesion. But the story continues, one of survival, adaptation, and revival. Assimilation was meant to end native cultures. Instead, it reshaped them, creating new identities forged in resistance and renewal. And though the policy itself faded after the mid-20th century, its echoes still ripple across native communities today. The story of assimilation did not end with laws or boarding schools. It seeped into the very fabric of native life, shaping daily experiences, family bonds, and community survival for decades. As the 20th century unfolded, new policies and pressures continued the quiet war on identity, but they also ignited unexpected sparks of resistance and renewal. One of the lesser-known but haunting aspects of this period was the government's push to relocate native peoples from reservations to urban centers. Beginning in the 1950s, the Indian Relocation Act of 1956 encouraged, or rather pressured, Native Americans to leave their lands and move to cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and Denver. Promised jobs, housing, and education, many made the journey with hope. But once there, they found discrimination, poverty, and isolation. The cultural safety nets of home were gone, replaced by the anonymity of sprawling urban life. The relocation program was meant to assimilate native people by breaking tribal ties and encouraging individualism. But for many, the experience was disorienting and alienating. They were caught between worlds, neither fully part of their tribal nations nor fully accepted by the cities. Some felt as if they were living in a limbo, uprooted but unseen. Another shadow cast during this time was the continuation of forced sterilizations. Between the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of Native women were sterilized without full consent, often coerced or misled by doctors and government officials. This program, part of a broader eugenics movement in the U.S., aimed to limit Native population growth and was carried out under the guise of family planning and public health. The trauma of these actions reverberates today, shaping distrust toward medical institutions and government programs. At the same time, Native artists, writers, and thinkers began reclaiming their narratives. The cultural suppression imposed by assimilation policies fueled a powerful renaissance. Figures like Vine Delore Jr. and Joy Harjo spoke out, mixing traditional wisdom with modern critique. Art and poetry became weapons of healing and resistance. One striking example is the rise of tribal colleges in the 1960s and 1970s. These institutions were founded by Native communities to provide culturally relevant education, teaching language, history, and traditions, alongside mainstream subjects. They became havens where students could embrace their identities, undo the damage of previous generations, and prepare to lead their communities forward. Despite the pain of forced assimilation, many Native families found strength in the reclamation of their heritage. Elders became teachers again, sharing ceremonies, songs, and stories once banned or hidden. Language immersion programs sprang up, often led by elders and young activists working together. These programs fought against the devastating loss of native tongues, some of which had only a handful of fluent speakers left. A particularly powerful fact is how some native communities adapted assimilation policies into tools for survival. For example, Some tribes used the opportunity to gain federal recognition and funding by navigating the government's bureaucratic systems, a way to secure resources while preserving as much sovereignty as possible. This complex dance between compliance and resistance is a defining feature of Native survival strategies. The era also saw growing political activism. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, groups like the American Indian Movement, AIM, challenged federal policies head-on. Protests, occupations, and legal battles highlighted ongoing injustices, from land rights to treaty enforcement. The famous 1973 Wounded Knee occupation was a direct response to decades of broken promises and cultural suppression. It brought national attention to Native struggles, forcing a reckoning with the past and present. Even today, the legacy of assimilation is felt deeply in Native communities. Issues such as disproportionate poverty, health disparities, and educational gaps trace back to these policies. But so does an enduring spirit of resilience and renewal. Across North America, Native peoples are reviving languages, restoring ceremonies, and asserting sovereignty in ways both ancient and modern. Assimilation policies sought to silence Native voices. Instead, those voices grew louder, weaving old traditions with new realities. They tell stories of loss and healing, pain and pride. The struggle to survive was never just about endurance. It was about reclaiming a future. And so, beneath the quiet surface of history, beneath the official records and forgotten laws, a living culture persists. It is a culture shaped by trauma, but fueled by hope. A testament that even the darkest attempts at erasure can never fully extinguish the human spirit. The winds of change began to stir in the mid-20th century. After decades of suffering under assimilation policies, forced removals, and broken treaties, Native American communities started to rise. Not with guns or violence, but with voices, with ceremonies, and with determination. The story of Native activism is a quiet yet powerful chapter, one filled with resilience, hope, and a reclaiming of identity that had been pushed to the margins for so long. One of the first sparks came from the return of veterans who had served in World War II. Thousands of Native men and women fought bravely overseas, yet returned home to discrimination and poverty. Many of them had glimpsed new ideas of freedom and equality while abroad, fueling a desire to fight for their own people's rights back home. This return planted seeds for what would become a growing movement of activism and cultural pride. During the 1950s and 1960s, as Native communities endured the continued pressures of termination policies and urban relocation programs, Native leaders and organizations began forming networks across reservations and cities. These networks were a lifeline, connecting isolated communities and giving rise to a collective voice. One lesser-known fact is that many Native activists initially used existing institutions like churches, schools, and local clubs as cover for organizing. Spaces where they could meet without attracting unwanted attention. The National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, founded in 1944, became a pivotal organization. It fought legal battles to restore tribal sovereignty, challenge termination, and protect treaty rights. But the movement was not only political, it was deeply cultural and spiritual. Native people began to reclaim languages, ceremonies, and stories that assimilation policies had tried to erase. The 1960s also saw the rise of new intellectual voices who challenged stereotypes and demanded respect. Writers like Vine Deloria Jr. emerged, using sharp critique and powerful scholarship to expose the injustices faced by Native peoples. His landmark book, Custer Died for Your Sins, published in 1969, questioned mainstream history and the government's treatment of Native Americans. It became a manifesto for a generation of activists hungry for justice. One of the most remarkable but less known aspects of this era was the reclaiming of traditional ceremonies and spirituality. For decades, these practices had been banned or forced underground. Now, gatherings such as the Sundance and the Potlatch began to resurface publicly, often serving as rallying points for political as well as cultural renewal. These ceremonies weren't just rituals, they were acts of defiance and survival, affirming identity in the face of centuries of attempted erasure. Amid this awakening, young Native Americans began to organize more directly. In 1968, a group of urban Native youth in Minneapolis formed the American Indian Movement, AIM. Originally focused on combating police harassment and poverty, AIM quickly grew into a national force advocating for treaty rights, sovereignty, and the restoration of lands. Their activism was rooted in traditional values, but also adapted to the realities of modern America. The movement's tactics were bold and unprecedented. They organized protests, occupations, and legal challenges that drew national attention. The occupation of Alcatraz Island, 1969 to 1971, is one of the most iconic moments. A group of activists, many of them young, claimed the island, once a federal prison, asserting that, under treaty law, unused federal land should revert to Native ownership. For 19 months, the occupation brought the plight of Native peoples into the spotlight, forcing the American public to confront centuries of injustice. This period also saw the growth of Native art as a form of political expression. Painters, sculptors, and performers infused traditional styles with contemporary themes, reflecting the pain and pride of their communities. Artists like John Quick-to-See Smith used their work to critique colonialism and celebrate Native identity. Their art became a language of resistance and renewal, visible proof that Native cultures were alive and evolving. Education, too, became a battleground for change. Tribal colleges began to spread, offering a new way to learn that centered Native histories, languages, and worldviews. These institutions were more than schools. They were cultural sanctuaries and incubators for the next generation of leaders. But activism was not without struggle. The government often responded with surveillance, infiltration, and sometimes violence. The 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation was a stark reminder of the stakes involved. For 71 days, AIM activists and tribal members held off federal agents in a tense standoff. Though violent clashes occurred, the event brought global attention to Native issues and sparked debate about sovereignty and justice that continues today. Throughout these turbulent times, Native communities maintained a steady pulse of resistance, adapting strategies from traditional diplomacy to modern protest. The rise of Native activism was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, determined resurgence, a reclaiming of voice and power that had long been denied. In the quiet moments between rallies and speeches, elders shared stories of resilience. Families rebuilt ties torn by years of boarding schools and relocation. Communities planted gardens of culture and hope nurturing languages and ceremonies that assimilation sought to destroy. The rise of Native activism was more than political. It was a spiritual revival. It reconnected people to the land, to ancestors, and to each other. It reminded the world that despite centuries of pain, Native peoples endured, not just as victims, but as creators of vibrant, living cultures. As you listen in the stillness of night, imagine those voices rising, low and steady, like a river flowing beneath the surface. Each chant, each protest, each whispered prayer, a thread weaving the past and future together. The story is far from over, but the awakening has begun. The momentum of Native activism in the late 1960s and 1970s carried a profound ripple effect that still shapes Native communities today. While the movement's public face often focused on protests and political action, the deeper, quieter currents of cultural renewal were just as powerful, a reclamation of identity that transformed individuals, families, and entire nations. One of the most inspiring, though less widely known aspects of this time was the role of women in the activism movement. While public attention often highlights male leaders, women were the backbone of many efforts, organizing grassroots campaigns, preserving languages, and revitalizing ceremonies. Activists like Wilma Mankiller, who would later become the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, emerged from this era of renewal. Her leadership combined political savvy with deep respect for tradition, showing that healing and activism were intertwined. The resurgence of native languages was another quiet revolution. Decades earlier, Native children had been punished for speaking their mother tongues in boarding schools. Now, Native elders and youth came together to rebuild these lost connections. In some cases, entire languages were nearly extinct, spoken only by a handful of elders. Dedicated language teachers recorded words, grammar, and stories, creating dictionaries and immersion programs to bring these tongues back from the brink. This work was not just academic, it was a vital reclaiming of identity and worldview. Activists also focused on restoring tribal sovereignty, the legal and political recognition that Native nations had the right to govern themselves. One pivotal moment was the passage of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. This law marked a shift away from the destructive policies of termination and assimilation toward one that allowed tribes to run their own programs, schools, healthcare, law enforcement, with federal funding. It gave Native nations tools to rebuild on their own terms. Yet this rebuilding was not easy. Many reservations were plagued by poverty, poor infrastructure, and limited resources. The scars of forced removal and assimilation policies left deep wounds. But Native communities used the newfound political space to assert control over their futures, balancing modern challenges with traditional values. The arts continued to play a crucial role in cultural resurgence. Beyond visual art, Native filmmakers, musicians, and writers began to tell their stories in their own voices. Films like Smoke Signals, 1998, based on a Sherman Alexie story, brought Native perspectives to wider audiences, breaking stereotypes and highlighting contemporary Native life with humor and poignancy. Political activism also expanded its scope to address environmental issues. Native communities have always held deep connections to the land, seeing it not as property, but as a living relative. In the 1970s and beyond, activists fought to protect sacred sites, water rights, and natural resources from corporate exploitation. These struggles connected Native sovereignty with broader environmental justice movements, emphasizing respect for nature as a core value. One surprising fact is how Native activism influenced federal policy beyond tribal affairs. The concept of self-determination, championed by Native leaders, helped inspire other marginalized groups seeking autonomy and rights. Native struggles became part of a larger tapestry of civil rights movements, linking their voices with African Americans, Latinx, and others fighting systemic oppression. Despite progress, Native activists continued to face challenges. Government agencies sometimes resisted tribal authority or imposed burdensome regulations. Internal divisions within tribes over strategy or leadership occasionally surfaced. But the enduring strength of the movement lay in its ability to bring together diverse voices, from elders to youth, urban activists to reservation residents, traditionalists to modernists, united by a shared commitment to survival and renewal. The rise of Native activism also changed how Native Americans were viewed by the broader public. Media portrayals began to shift from caricatures to more nuanced stories. Educational curricula slowly started to include Native histories and contributions. Though gaps remain, Native voices became harder to ignore, demanding respect and recognition. As you listen quietly, imagine the gathering of voices in council halls, at powwows, in city streets, weaving a tapestry of hope and defiance. The struggle is ongoing, but the path forward is carved with courage and wisdom. This chapter of Native history reminds us that cultural survival is an act of resistance. Even when battered by centuries of colonization, Native peoples refused to vanish. Instead, they chose to rise, to heal, and to teach the world a different way of being, rooted in community, respect for the earth, and the enduring power of identity. The echoes of their voices carry on in every language lesson, every reclaimed tradition, every march for justice. They remind us that history is not only what happened long ago, but what continues to unfold, shaped by those who refuse to be forgotten. The story of Native Americans is one of endurance against overwhelming odds, but also one of ongoing renewal, a journey not yet complete. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, Native nations faced the daunting task of healing from centuries of trauma while reclaiming sovereignty and self-determination in a world that often still misunderstood or ignored them. This path forward is complex, filled with both challenges and remarkable resilience. Healing, at its core, means more than just repairing physical wounds or economic hardships. It requires addressing the deep, intergenerational trauma inflicted by removal, boarding schools, forced assimilation, and broken treaties. One little-known but profoundly important concept embraced by many Native communities is historical trauma, the collective emotional and psychological injury passed down through generations. It is an invisible weight carried by many Native people, affecting mental health, family relationships, and community well-being. This recognition of historical trauma has spurred new approaches to healing, combining traditional Native wisdom with modern mental health practices. Healing circles, sweat lodges, and talking circles have become spaces where stories are shared, grief is honored, and strength is nurtured. These ceremonies are not simply spiritual rituals, but critical forms of therapy rooted in centuries-old understandings of balance and harmony. the role of language revitalization remains central in this healing journey. Language is more than communication. It is a vessel of culture, identity, and worldview. Across many tribes, elders and young learners work side by side in immersion schools and digital programs, breathing life back into languages once nearly lost. This revival is a powerful act of resistance and healing, reconnecting individuals with their ancestors and traditions. At the same time, Native nations continue to strengthen their sovereignty, the inherent right to govern themselves, manage their lands, and protect their cultures. Sovereignty is not just a political concept. It is the foundation for cultural survival and economic development. Many tribes have expanded control over natural resources, built health clinics, schools, and courts, and negotiated compacts with federal and state governments to operate casinos and other enterprises. One interesting fact is how Native sovereignty is intertwined with environmental stewardship. Many Native nations see themselves as caretakers of the land, water, and wildlife, responsibilities handed down through generations. This traditional ecological knowledge is gaining wider recognition as vital for addressing modern challenges like climate change and habitat destruction. Despite progress, the path forward is not without obstacles. Legal battles over land rights and jurisdiction continue to surface as state and federal governments sometimes challenge tribal authority. Funding for education, healthcare, and infrastructure often remains inadequate, deepening inequalities. Yet, Native leaders and communities persist in advocating for their rights and futures. Youth play a crucial role in this ongoing renewal. Inspired by their ancestors' struggles and their own visions for the future, Native young people lead language programs, cultural initiatives, and activism on issues from climate change to voting rights. Their efforts bridge traditional knowledge and modern tools, ensuring that the legacy of resilience continues. Another lesser-known but vital development is the growth of Native-led mental health and social services that integrate cultural practices. These programs recognize the unique challenges Native communities face and offer culturally sensitive care. They provide spaces where healing is holistic, addressing mind, body, and spirit. The arts remain a vibrant expression of this renewal. Contemporary Native writers, filmmakers, musicians, and visual artists tell stories that challenge stereotypes and celebrate complexity. Through their work, they invite wider audiences to understand Native histories and contemporary life not as relics of the past, but as living, evolving narratives. Education continues to be a battleground and a beacon of hope. Tribal colleges, public schools with culturally relevant curricula, and programs that encourage Native students to pursue higher education contribute to a new generation empowered to lead. These efforts counter the legacy of boarding schools and assimilation, emphasizing pride and identity. The path forward also includes reclaiming history. Museums, archives, and cultural centers run by Native communities work tirelessly to preserve artifacts, oral histories, and sacred knowledge. This work is a powerful assertion that Native peoples are not just subjects of history, but its keepers and storytellers. As the 21st century unfolds, Native nations continue navigating the delicate balance between tradition and change. This balance is not always easy. It requires embracing innovation without losing sight of cultural foundations. But it is a testament to enduring strength and vision. In the quiet moments of reflection, one can imagine the healing taking place in sweat lodges, in classrooms, in council meetings, and in family gatherings. It is a healing woven with sorrow and joy, loss and hope, a healing that moves forward with each step towards sovereignty and self-determination. This ongoing journey reminds us that history is not just the story of what happened long ago, but the story of what continues to happen, shaped by those who refuse to be erased. The path forward for Native Americans is a path of healing, resilience, and renewal. A path walked with courage and guided by the wisdom of ancestors. As Native communities continue to navigate their future, the path forward is marked by both healing from past wounds and an ongoing assertion of sovereignty that reshapes their relationship with the wider world. This journey is a delicate dance, balancing centuries-old traditions with modern realities, all while confronting challenges that are as complex as they are persistent. One striking but often overlooked aspect of this era is the growing movement toward intertribal cooperation. While tribal nations are sovereign and distinct, many have realized the power of working together to amplify their voices. Intertribal councils and coalitions address issues that transcend individual borders, from environmental protection to legal advocacy. For example, the Intertribal Agriculture Council works to support Native farmers across the country, reconnecting food production to cultural practices and economic sustainability. This cooperation creates a sense of solidarity that strengthens all involved. In addition, many Native nations have embraced economic development as a tool for sovereignty and healing. Enterprises such as gaming casinos, cultural tourism, and natural resource management provide essential revenue streams for infrastructure, education, and healthcare. But beyond economics, these businesses serve as platforms for cultural expression and pride. For instance, some casinos incorporate traditional art, music, and language into their design and operations, reminding visitors and community members alike of the rich heritage behind the enterprise. Another lesser-known fact is the rise of Native technology and innovation initiatives. Young Native entrepreneurs and tech experts are developing apps for language learning, environmental monitoring, and healthcare delivery tailored specifically for Indigenous communities. These innovations blend tradition with technology, ensuring that cultural preservation and contemporary advancement walk hand in hand. The revitalization of traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, is also a central pillar of healing and sovereignty. For thousands of years, Native peoples have maintained complex relationships with the land, guided by a profound understanding of ecosystems and sustainability. In recent decades, this knowledge has been recognized as invaluable in addressing environmental crises such as climate change, habitat loss, and water scarcity. Native-led conservation efforts not only protect sacred sites, but also contribute scientific insights rooted in centuries of observation. However, the path forward is not without tension. Sovereignty often means asserting control over lands and resources in the face of ongoing disputes with state and federal governments, corporations, and other interests. Legal battles continue, sometimes requiring tribes to engage with systems designed to undermine them. Yet, these struggles also serve to educate the broader public about Indigenous rights and the importance of honoring treaties. Healing also involves confronting social challenges that persist due to historical trauma and systemic inequities. Issues like poverty, addiction, and health disparities remain prevalent in many Native communities. To to address these, tribes are developing culturally grounded health programs that combine Western medicine with traditional healing practices. This holistic approach honors the spiritual and communal aspects of health, emphasizing prevention, family, and connection to land. Education remains a critical arena for growth. Beyond tribal colleges, many public schools near reservations are now incorporating Native history, language, and culture into their curricula. This inclusion fosters understanding and respect among all students while affirming Native youth's identities. Scholarships, mentorship programs, and leadership training further empower young Native people to become advocates for their communities. Art and storytelling continue to flourish as expressions of identity and resilience. Contemporary Native writers, poets, filmmakers, and musicians use their platforms to challenge stereotypes and celebrate complexity. Works by authors like Louise Erdrich and filmmakers like Sterling Harjo explore themes of family, history, and cultural survival with nuance and depth. Through these creative voices, Native stories reach wider audiences, fostering empathy and awareness. At the heart of this ongoing renewal is a commitment to intergenerational connection. Elders pass down wisdom, stories, and ceremonies, while youth bring energy, new ideas, and technology. This exchange sustains culture and ensures that traditions adapt rather than disappear. Many communities host cultural camps, language immersion programs, and mentorship opportunities that nurture these bonds. The path forward also involves reclaiming and protecting sacred spaces. Many sites, from burial grounds to ceremonial areas, were desecrated or taken during colonization. Today, Native nations advocate for their return and stewardship. These efforts are acts of both spiritual and political sovereignty, affirming the deep connections between people, land, and identity. Legal victories, such as the 2016 Supreme Court ruling in McGirt v. Oklahoma, have reaffirmed the validity of reservation boundaries and tribal jurisdiction, underscoring the enduring strength of treaties and Native law. These rulings not only restore legal rights, but also symbolize recognition of Native sovereignty at the highest levels. The path forward also embraces healing through cultural revitalization events like powwows, festivals, and language workshops. These gatherings are not only celebrations, but also educational spaces where traditions are passed on and community bonds strengthened. They remind both Native and non-Native people alike of the vibrancy and living nature of Indigenous cultures. Ultimately, the path forward for Native Americans is a story of survival and renewal that refuses to be defined solely by past suffering. It is about reclaiming voices, lands, and futures. It is about honoring ancestors while embracing change. It is a journey walked with patience, courage, and an unbreakable spirit. As you listen, let the steady rhythm of this renewal wash over you, the quiet determination of communities healing, rebuilding, and asserting sovereignty. The story is ongoing, written by those who carry the legacy of resilience and the promise of tomorrow.